So just a few housekeeping tips. One, we are recording, so you can come back to this later if you want to pick up on some of the things that we're talking about. And of course, share it with your colleagues. And we also are not doing a Q&A because we want to make sure we spend all of our time getting inside of Anne's head with some very deep questions. But there is a questions section underneath the video window here. So if you have a question, please leave it there and we'll do our best to answer it after we're done with the session. So we're just going to jump right in. So Anne, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to it, and it's good to see you.
Yes, you too. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So Anne and I have spent many, many hours together on a board at Stevens Institute, which is a big technical school here, years ago, helping them start their analytics program, and that's where we met. So supply chains, that's kind of your thing. And I don't know much about them, but I imagine that it's pretty complex. And there's a lot of pieces that have to work together, which is obviously going to be even more challenging to do analytics, trying to figure out, which piece is causing what kind of reaction. So let's just say you're at a new customer and you start digging into the project together and you say to them, hey, I see something like this pretty often when we're dealing with supply chain analytics. Here's something that you can do in just a few days that will start to make a difference in this project. So what's something that you might be seeing in that kind of situation, and what are you recommending that someone can do in a short term to get started?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because every supply chain is different, especially these days, and especially as we're seeing supply lines shut down and different factories suddenly become unavailable and having to make quick switches from one part of your supply chain to the other. But when you're looking at it from an analytics perspective, I think the first thing really to look at is understanding your data. Where is your data? What does your data look like? Like, not to a point of analysis paralysis. I think we've all been guilty of that at various points in our career, but let's really understand the data that drives your supply chain. So understanding what all the nodes are in your supply chain, what the actual information is that makes that piece of the supply chain critical to your success. And by being able to understand that from a data perspective, you're setting yourself up to start with your analytics.
So do you find that that's a big problem when you go in, that it's not coordinated yet, and that and it's either that they don't know, or it's not where they can pull the data together, both?
I mean, honestly, the biggest thing that I and my colleagues find when we go in to speak with any of our customers is that they've approached their supply chain in a really siloed manner. So not only is the data siloed to one particular piece of the supply chain, but that's propagated throughout that end-to-end supply chain. So these little islands of isolation, and they might be understood in that little microcosm, but there's very little understanding of the impact of one part of your supply chain on the next part of your supply chain. And then let's extend it beyond the actual supply chain itself. What does that mean from a marketing perspective? What does that mean from a finance perspective? So this notion of understanding and starting to see your supply chain through a singular lens, in really a concurrent type of way, is really what's going to allow you to start seeing a significant shift in performance of a supply chain, and really as a step into creating the right supply chain analytics.
Yeah, actually, as you were using that word silo, and it hit me in a bit of a different way than I'm used to thinking about it, because usually you hear silo as a kind of corporate function. Oh, our data is in silos, but now you're talking about silos, and this is my interpretation of what you're saying, silos in that your supply chain is across different companies and vendors and suppliers and
so similarly to the way you just described it, within an organization, if you think about the supply chain, there's distinctive pieces. Like, unlike a function that might be like finance or something that really is a moment in time, a supply chain is truly that. It's a chain. So you have somebody who's looking at the front end, at the customer side, understanding the demand. There's somebody that's working at the back end, understanding what does your supply need to be? What does that manufacturing need to be? And each of those steps are frequently tackled in isolation. Even mathematically, they're tackled in isolation. Let's create a supply planning model. Let's create our shop floor planning model. Let's create a demand forecasting model, which is great. But if you're solving for each of those in their own microcosm, you're missing the opportunity to really make sure you're doing the best thing for the end-to-end supply chain and ultimately the best thing for the company.
Wow. Yeah, that's, and I started by saying this is complex, and then now I'm really thinking like, wow, complex isn't even probably a strong enough word for what you just described.
Well, if you think like that, let's think about it. A high tech. I don't have my cell phone handy. Oh yeah, something like this, where you think about all of the components that go into manufacturing a supply chain, and then ultimately, like my former employer selling something like this. Well, they're not manufacturing it, and somebody is particularly manufacturing the camera lens. Somebody else is responsible for the internal components. So you have to coordinate all of those supply chains to come together to be able to have that product and make it available to then ultimately sell through whoever's actually doing that end of it. So yes, you think about it within one company, but per your other comment, yes, we're going across multiple companies, multiple manufacturers, multiple all the way down to the raw materials. You need to understand that full end to end. And I'll tell you, these days, that has become a lot more complex.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's kind of the good and bad that the data is more available probably, but now you have to figure out how to handle it. So is there a part, if you think about the whole sequence of, and I know you said every supply chain is really different, but is there a spot within that you think analytics and the data is at most risk of breaking that whole sequence?
I'm not sure I've totally, let me see if I can rephrase the question. So where is the data maybe the most critical, or maybe where do we have the least amount of data? I think every phase has a different level of importance, right? Depending on what it is the product is that you're trying to deliver through your supply chain. At the front end, these days, I would say that the reliance on historical data is likely going to cause people to fall down, right? What happened a year ago, if you think about a forecasting model, right, the data that tells you what happened a year ago, it's going to be fairly useless right now. Understanding sort of all of the social sentiment data and the dynamics of the really short term are what's going to be more relevant and credible to you crafting what that demand plan looks like, and then ensuring that you're putting a lens over that. We had a customer who said to me, we had an entire month's worth of demand in one day. So wicked bullwhip effect, like a huge demand spike. Now the question is that useful? Is that going to repeat itself in the future? Or was that just a one-off, outlier event? And so that's where you need to mix the human intuition and have a comfort level with this sort of expert judgment, human intuition, along with your mathematical modeling that tells you, okay, which information should I use? What is relevant? And let me create that all together to be able to start making the decisions that drive my supply chain. So I think we're really at a moment in time where it's that mix of the mathematical modeling and the expert judgment that's really going to help. Those are the companies that are going to come out ahead out of all of this craziness.
Yeah, it's good to hear you kind of reiterate that, because the attention on this idea of, it can just be all computer driven and you don't need people, and the more I talk to people, the more I hear reflected of what you just said too, that it's the human input is so critical, especially in a time when there's so much uncertainty, probably even more so.
Mm-hmm. Actually, even during regular times, though, if you think again, let's go back to this sort of supply chain design. You have multiple nodes, And there's a faculty member out there. Her name's Nada Saunders. I don't know Sanders. I'm not sure if you've crossed paths with her, but she makes the comment that you can have the most sophisticated, whether it's AI driven or the most sophisticated prescriptive analytic models at one node of your supply chain. But if you aren't able to consume that at the next stage, then all you have is a very intelligent island of isolation. And so, yes, it's more complex these days, absolutely. But even during regular times, if we're not thinking holistically, we're really going to start to see we're not going to realize the value from our mathematical investment.
Yeah, actually, this kind of leads me into thinking a thought that leads me into the next question. So, I think this is probably identifying a lot of areas of weakness. I imagine, just like, we've seen all kinds of things, right? In general, like you're exposing things when they become so intense. So this whole experience that we've gone through the last 5-6 months has caused, disruptions, I'm sure, in the physical aspects of the supply chain, right? Whether it's toilet paper or, camera, covers for iPhones. And I know there's also a big push for companies now from a supply chain perspective to get more digital, more quickly. And the problem that, in general is that change, this change always makes people uncomfortable. So I'm curious, can you talk about a time when either you personally, or maybe you had to get a customer or a team to push past their comfort zone? And why was it so hard to do that?
I think I've built my career on that statement around pushing for change. And, if there's one thing that this whole situation has taught us, is that humans have a much greater capacity for change than maybe any of us gave ourselves credit for, right? We've all pivoted so amazingly. And how many companies say, I thought I was going to have a big productivity hit, but amazingly, we're rocking and rolling. We're still, in a fortunate position of being busy. And I'll say my company is like this, and we're able to work from home, go all remote. Now, having said that, a large digital transformation project, which I've had the honor and opportunity to do several times through my career, really does meet with a lot of resistance, because humans, they don't like to change necessarily, right? There is really a resistance there onto doing something new, particularly if you have those shiny new, Stevens master students graduates who've just joined you in your workplace with the latest and greatest models in their back pocket, and they're going to be challenged. So the question is how do you approach those problems? And then oftentimes you'll find yourself even more challenged when we're trying to shop around a vitamin than necessarily a cure. Like right now, I think some of our analytical models are really more of a get well plan. But it's first in really truly understanding the problem, and maybe don't pick the biggest and most scariest and most exposed problem. But for an analytics, somebody who's in analytics, who truly understands, who's met with the stakeholders, who's met with those experts to really understand what the situation is, and starts tackling, maybe it's the B products that are not the A products, not the ones that are going to make or break your company, but let's use the math on the B products. They're still worthy, they still bring a lot of value to the company, but there's not as much exposure. And working with those experts, truly understand what are all of the attributes that need to be validated by those experts so that they feel that they were part of creating those models. And by having that combination and taking it in bite-sized pieces, you'll find, I think one of my very first roles way back, we call them mathematical rapid prototypes, right? Let's look at it. Let's do a very small version. Let's show that we have improvement. Let's add an additional mathematical model into the mix. Let's show additional improvement. Let's bring people in. Let's allow them to see how the math works. Let's let them ask any question they want to. And once you start to build that credibility, and you see the wins, and you expand the products that you're applying it to, you expand the space, you've got more of, it's not just a person of one, you've got you have an executive sponsor for what you're doing, you have other peers who are vocalizing and speaking on your behalf, you'll find that once you start showing successes, that the demand and interest starts to sort of skyrocket from there. And it's almost being prepared for sudden success once you show the successes. But it really is truly that, as I've said already a couple of times, that expertise, the domain experts, along with the mathematical experts, maybe it's one and the same, should you be so lucky as to find a unicorn like that. However, more often than not, there's people that have been in the roles, they've been successful to this point using the methods that they know. So making sure that you still honor that and that intellectual intelligence along with the model building pieces.
So it sounds, what I took away from that is a couple things. One is general risk, right? So risk causes discomfort, and there's probably, given how hard it is to see underneath all those levels of the supply chain, it could seem pretty risky. So that's kind of one. But then the other side is actually bringing people in, not together, not necessarily to give them the gory details of the models and all that, but having them be part of the work cycle, so that it's not like, oh, there's somebody came up with some algorithm and it threw it in, and they didn't necessarily have their input to that, or they weren't involved in the right ways, and so they see the risk of that as high.
Yeah.
And that's what gets in the way of them being able to move forward.
That's absolutely right. So nobody likes to trust a black box, right? I mean, you put it in, some magic happens, and you get an output. That's not useful. Interpretable analytics has really taken many advances over the last 5 to 10 years. We're seeing more and more ways of really understanding what the analytics are doing for you, and whether it's something, within the solution, within RapidResponse, we actually provide SHAP diagrams that allow you to understand, here's your forecast model. This is how much it's contributed because of expected weather issues. Here's because there's a deviation in what your expected demand is. And you can will actually help you understand your forecasting model in the context of the data that was put into the model, right? The interpretability that's a hot topic. There's some experts out there that you should bring in just to talk about interpretable analytics.
I actually haven't heard that term before, so I'm going to dig in. So thanks for that one. So when you think about this going back to the kind of bringing people together, what are some of the challenges of actually making that happen, right? Because it's easy to say, oh, you should just get your stakeholders together, or however people say it, right? But the reality is there's still lots of reasons that people don't want to do that, or that those meetings are not necessarily people feel like they're on equal footing in there. Like if it's some executive, say for example, and then somebody writing an algorithm who might feel intimidated by that executive, or what. And I don't mean to put people in boxes like that, but how do you deal with something like that?
A company, before you embark on whichever supply chain, marketing, financial, whatever type of modeling you're doing, you really do need somebody in a leadership level who's the sponsor of those activities, who's going to act in that executive sponsor seat, who will provide air cover, because as we know, the more complex the analytics, you don't always get a positive result, right? It's a little bit of a high risk, high reward situation, and that's true for many different analytical models. Like you may get nothing out of it, and that's okay, because often in the failures of a model not working, you have as much learning about the dynamics of your business as when one does.
Right.
But we don't all have the appetite or the luxury for that. So you really need to have an executive sponsor who can represent and understands enough of the dynamics of the modeling activities that you're about to embark on to represent that with their peer group, right? Whether it's a C-level, or whether it's VPs within the supply chain, or whatever that community happens to be. So establishing that executive sponsorship. I think you had sent me some question about finding a bottle on the ground, and
We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that one. Yeah.
Well, I just, my team told me not to pick up any dirty bottles off the ground, but just my thought around on that piece and what's the big, and you can certainly ask the question again. I'll figure out something else to respond. But change management, the science of change management, is probably the biggest piece that I think is missing out of most educational programs. When you learn engineering, if you're learning math, if you're learning analytics to apply in business, you need to know the psychology of change. And part of that is understanding your audience, understanding the people who are going to be affected by that change. So how do you prove that you yourself understand the dynamics of the business enough that your model is going to actually be reflective as closely as possible to the actualities of the business? How do you have the right lingo? Are you talking when you say a SKU? Do they mean a SKU or do they mean a part? Or are you speaking the same language in a way that they can understand? And that change management, I think, is, if you were going to add anything to complement an analytics background, adding change management with that, those two together is going to be the power to actually drive value from the application of analytics, because it helps you take the people who are going to be impacted by it, the people who have to use the output, the ones that ultimately need to give you credit for doing this. That's going to be the skill set that's going to drive the value at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I see that a lot, even in the way I'm working with customers. And what I found to be successful is that you can teach them kind of, whether it's analytic techniques or even software techniques, that it's that interpersonal play that most people just don't have it. I mean, if you're a super tight-knit team, maybe among the team members, but once you break out of that and you get to whether it's an external customer or some other internal type customer, that especially now as a lot of the people are more interested in data these days, right? So you're touching new parts of the company who want that. And then, so these are people you probably don't even have any relationship with, and they're just coming in saying, get me data, do this, right? And so going through that, and that's part of change management, just at a very basic level. Forget about, real deep kind of stuff. So let's kind of lead right into that question you alluded to, and maybe we'll kind of expand on this idea if it makes sense. So next week is Labor Day. So you probably have a long weekend. And I know, being up in Toronto, it's possible you're heading out to your cottage or a friend's cottage. And so your picture, you're walking along a lake and you find a bottle, and there's kind of a strange note inside. And it says, it's actually addressed to you. It says, Anne, I want you to think of one analytics skill that you wish every one of your customers could be great at. So when you have a clear idea of this, throw the bottle back into the lake as far as you can. I mean, and then really throw it hard, get it back in there. So what did you wish for your customers?
I think the biggest analytics skill to be really well versed at is to be an analytical storyteller, right? You need to be able to, through your data and through your models, to be able to understand what's happening with your business and interpret that into the business context. I think what you referred to earlier, you say, come in, I just need the data, do this or that. Oftentimes, what's being asked for is as a result of a symptom, not necessarily as a result of the actual underlying problem. And the better you become at understanding your data and being able to tell the story in the context of your business, the better improvements you're going to get, the better value from those improvements, because you can articulate the value that they're going to bring to your organization. So I think that, to me, is a really important skill to add. Now, certainly, I told you I did chat with my team about this, who said, please don't pick up any dirty bottles off of the side of the road, please. These days, we don't want to touch anything that's suspicious, and this sounds like a fairly suspicious bottle. However, you still want people who are good at their craft, right? Understand your statistical science and being able to understand basics, or causation versus correlation and this kind of thing. Then you also want to make sure that you understand supply chain science, what I talked about earlier, right? Somebody needs to understand that supply chain is all about trade-offs, your cost, quality, and delivery. You want to understand that. But all of that is almost moot if you can't explain it. And that explainability, I guess it goes back to the interpretability of the models, but really it's the interpretability of your data and that ability to string it together and to explain the story of what's happening.
So in when you say data storytelling or data story, can you give a more specific example? And I ask because that's an area that I spend a lot of time in, but I also think it's kind of a phrase that's used a lot, and people can take it can mean a lot of different things. So in your world, what does that mean?
Yeah, it's the ability to understand where are your shortcomings in your performance. Why aren't you satisfying customers to their expectation? Is it because you're not getting it to them on time? Is it because your mix of products isn't meeting the right? Are the wrong things in the wrong place at the wrong time? And what are the root causes of that? And being able to build your story and understand what's the data telling you? Where are those gaps? What's driving the gaps in performance? And then if we apply model X, how is that going to change things? And can we put that in the context of value, right? And I think that's oftentimes we can see an improvement in a metric, but if the metric isn't put in the context of the business, then we're still missing that gap to value. And so the ability to string that together and describe what's going on, leveraging visualizations, which I know is an area of expertise for you, that helps. That absolutely helps with the storytelling. It takes you from telling it through the data to actually telling it through the visuals, which is certainly a lot easier for consumption by a broader audience. But it's really that understand through your data to be able to root cause what the issues are and interpret them in the context of the business.
Yeah, so it's two key things, right? It's that to be able to do that is like you said, understanding the data, but understanding the business well enough so that when you discuss it with somebody, all the things you said before, you're speaking their language, and ultimately that it just makes, you're making sense, and that it's kind of all the pieces fit together in that. And I guess the output of that is some kind of, ultimately it's a recommendation, right? We're talking about the end of the story is here's either one or multiple things we should be doing, or unless it's the people saying the story is about something that they already did, right? Whatever.
But just to add on that, I think that's why this whole notion around citizen data scientist really caught my attention. That yes, you can be great from a business perspective, but you need to understand the math enough as well. And in our world, we're actually saying, the next generation of supply chain professional really needs to be a supply chain citizen data scientist, somebody that understands the math enough to speak to it. The tools are generally sophisticated enough out there. Maybe you don't have to build your models from scratch. You can leverage a platform like ours, right, to be able to do those models for you. But you need to understand, what does that mean for marketing? What does that mean from a financial perspective? Can I understand the dynamic of the product that I'm supporting, that I'm delivering to the marketplace? So the expectations on that supply chain professional, whereas historically they might have been a little bit more, I've seen them sort of a number cruncher type, is really to have business expertise, mathematical expertise, as well as communication, influence, and change management skills, right? It's really an evolution and a great profession for anybody who's looking to get in.
Well, I think that's a good spot to end, because it really highlights kind of all the way through what we've been talking about, like some of the things from the beginning about getting your data in order, and then the human side in the middle there about comfort zone, and then this kind of bringing it all together. Obviously, there's a lot of pieces we talked about, but and I think what the things you've described probably reflect other types of analytics and businesses, but I think yours in particular, because of those, there's so many pieces that could be in there, maybe more than someone like in finance who's even in finance, there's different pieces they have to put together. But I think you could take some of these lessons and apply it there. I do like the idea. I'll just kind of throw my 2 cents in about one thing you said about kind of this agile math sense, right? Like, let's make a little model, let's build on it. And I think those wins, anytime in this world of analytics, where you can make small wins and build on them. Whereas I think historically there's this idea of like, let's do a project, right? And then you do it, and then it's like, well, let's see what happens.
Right.
And then you find out that either it didn't come out the way you want, or you blew a step early on, and then you're cycling back. And these, I think that agile idea is something that still has to be adopted in a lot of places. People talk about it, but I think it goes back to one of those change management things. We got to change the way we have done our work in the past as well. So I'm glad you really brought that one up. And I'm going to look up this what was it again? Interpretable analytics. Yeah, that's a new one we're going to have to find. So let's close it out. I want to be respectful of your time and our audience, right at the mark. So thanks again, Ann. It was great to spend some time with you, and thanks for sharing your ideas and your experience.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. So long.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.